Here's our graph, here's our material, let's get to it. So like usual, I've just gone up to File here, clicked on New Substance. I went down to my new template, which is a custom template I've saved, and then I've gone ahead and just typed in marble tile for my new graph. If you don't have this new template saved, just go ahead into the description below and check out a previous video I've done where we just create our own template saves. So once you do that, you go ahead and you get this nice template here, and we've got our base material set up for us so that we're going to start to be able to see what our material is going to look like in our 3D view here. So the first thing I want to do is right click on this guy and view in 3D, and we're going to get it showing up in our viewport here. And I also want to go ahead and click on Materials, Default, and Edit. And I want to come over to where it says Height here. I'm going to crank our scale up to 1. And this is going to allow us to use our parallax occlusion for our height map. So to start off this material, what I want to do is I want to create a simple shape node. And so I'm going to take this guy and plug him into my normal and my histogram range here. And with this guy, what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating the tile pattern that we're going to use for our marble. And so I'm going to take this shape and I'm going to Control D to duplicate it, and I'm going to bring it up over top. And so what I'm going to do is blend these two shapes together because we're going to use one to cut away at the bottom. And you'll see what I do here in a second. So we plug them in over top. And with our blend selected, I want to come over to our blending mode here. And I'm going to go down to subtract. And now it's going to delete all of our information from the bottom because it's taking all the white values in our top and subtracting it from the bottom one. So you can see that because we have two completely white texture sets, it's going to eliminate all of the white value and just give us a black result. So with that, what I want to do is create a bit of a more interesting shape with our top one here so that when we subtract information, we're going to kind of be getting the separation of the tiles and the little design in the middle or in the intersection, I guess, of all those cutaways. So in order to do that, just in our top shape, I want to come down and I want to find where it says rotation 45 degrees. And when I click that, nothing's really going to happen initially because we still have our scale set too high. So when I start peeling away our scale, you can see that we've rotated our square here on a 45-degree angle. And so we're going to use this to cut away from our material. And so if I double click on our blend here and I single click back onto our shape, you can see what it's actually doing. So when we square down the scale here, we get the nice little intersection where all of our grout or the crevices between our tiles is going to run through, and it's going to create a nice kind of ornate shape for us. But the problem is we don't actually have any tile running through here, and it's just kind of one block. And so what I want to do is come back to the first tile or the first shape we have, and I'm just going to tile it up to 2. And then I'm going to come down to our scale here, and I'm going to start to peel this guy away. And you can see now that we get a nice kind of base geometry for our tile, and we get some nice little ornate shapes as well. So I'm going to put this up to something like 0.98 so that we get just a little bit going through our tiles. And if I spacebar in the 2D view here, you can see that it tiles nice and seamlessly. So from there, what I want to do is I want to run this blend through an edge detect. And what this is going to do is kind of soften the edges here and round them out a little bit. And it's going to give us this nice little shape in the middle here so that it's not just a complete hole. And you can see that if I just delete this guy, we just get a nice indent in there but I want to have a little piece right in the middle that we're gonna kind of add a little bit of a decorative design to. I just want to come over to our normal as well, and I'll bump this up to something like 5, just so we get a solid normal map. So we can play around with our edge detect a little bit, changing the width to get it a little bit smoother, or a little bit thinner, I should say. I'm going to do something like 1.5, and we can also change the roundness of the edges if we don't want something, you know, completely smooth or like circular. So I'm going to do something like 1.5 as well, so that we get some nice little rounded corners, but for the most part it's pretty sharp. And now the next thing that I want to do is I want to take our edge detect and I want to kind of augment it just a little bit, because right now what we're getting is height information for both our tiles and the cracks between them. But in between the tiles, I want to have those as kind of like a metal seam or a metal tile running across, instead of it just going down to kind of the bottom of our texture. And so in order to get around that, I'm going to do a little bit of some stuff off to the side. So the first thing I want to do is invert grayscale, because I want to get the dark values and switch them to be lighter. So I'm going to take this guy here and plug him into grayscale. And so now we're going to get all of our darker recessed values as white. And so I'm going to run these guys through a bevel node. And this is going to allow us to kind of make a nice smooth and rounded filling that we're going to be able to use and put over top of our texture here, our edge detect. So the first thing I want to come to is our distance, and this is going to be how far the information kind of bevels off of our initial geometry here. And this is why we made sure that we inverted it so that we get this as our white values. And you can see that if I go negative, it actually bevels inwards. And so I don't want to bevel inwards, but I want to do something around 0.03. And then I want to come down to smoothing, because it's going to, if I take a closer look here, kind of round out everything. And so I don't want it to be too round, because it's going to be very hard to see when we overlay it over top of our texture here. So I'm going to bring this smoothing to about 1. And so we've just kind of created the caulking, or the filling in between our tiles, and I want to blend this back into our chain. I'm going to add if I click on our graph here, a blend, making sure to take our edge detect in the bottom and taking our bevel in over top. And so now I want to plug this guy into our normal and our histogram. And you can see right now we're getting the bevel, or the caulking, but I need to blend these together so that they actually work together with both of these textures. So what I want to do with that is I want to take our invert grayscale here and use this guy as a mask to blend between the two, so that when I do that, you can see that we get a very subtle transition between our tile where it cuts off, and then we get to use the bevel here. And if I play around with the bevel, you're going to be able to see how it affects our mesh here, but it only affects the caulking. And so for the rest of our initial tile pattern here, I want to start creating a little bit more of a unique middle piece here, something that's gonna kind of be the central focus of what our material is. And so what I'm going to do is come back to our first cutaway here, and I'm going to Control D that. I'm going to bring this guy ahead. And so now what I want to do is continue to add a couple blends onto my chain here, because we're going to start taking away and adding some new geometry. And so I'm going to take this guy here, and I'm going to plug him in over top. And I'm actually going to get rid of this blend just for now so we can see what we're doing in our 3D. And so like the past blend, I want to just take this blend here and I want to go to subtract. And I'm going to subtract the white information again from any of the white information in our texture below. And what that's going to do right now is just completely get rid of our middle piece. And I just want to scale this guy down so that we get a nice little indent right in our center piece here. And as we continue, I'm going to add another blend. And I'm going to click on this shape here and Control D as well. And I'm going to plug this guy in over top. But now I want to have a little bit more of like a pyramid kind of shape, kind of coming back up out towards our viewer. And so what I want to do is change this shape down to pyramid in our little drop down here. But now because I want this to go outwards instead of cutting into the geometry, I have to change our blending mode to a different blending mode. And I want to switch that down to screen. And what screen is going to do is get rid of all the black or darker values, and it's going to keep the whiter or lighter values of our top texture here. So when I go down to screen, you can see that it has our pyramid facing back up out towards our material. But the problem is that we have such a dark contrast between our two background and foreground textures here that it's going to be cut real deep into our material. And so with that, what I want to do is come back to our blend here where we cut away, and I want to just decrease the opacity on that guy. Bring that right up towards the top there so that it's not as drastic of a cut as it initially was. And so now we get a nice little pattern right in the center design of our tiles here, and it's going to be a nice focal piece for our material. So now that we've created the base pattern for our tiles, I want to go ahead and start tiling it by adding a generator, and this is going to be our full control for how many tiles we have throughout the entirety of creating this material. And so on top of our blend, I'm going to add a tile generator. I want to make sure that I plug this guy into our top here and delete the bottom input. And I want to come into the tile generator's parameters. And the first thing I want to do is find pattern, and I want to switch this to image input. And we're going to get a bunch of different tiles all across our material. And we can see in our 2D texture here that we've got a lot of small little tiles. So I want to come back up to our X and Y amount here, and I'm just going to do 2 in each. And this is going to just tile a little bit more our marble tiles across our material. And this is going to give us full control with how many tiles we want to actually have when scaling up or down. The last thing that I want to do for our geometry or our pattern is I want to add a little bit more contrast, because right now we don't have a lot of color contrast or value contrast, so it's very, very flat. So in order to accentuate that a little bit more, I want to add a histogram scan. And so right now we're going to get black, because what a scan does is it actually scans through all of the color values and displays them in our 2D texture here. And you can see that when I take our position and scan it up, it's actually scanning through the values and displaying them based on where they are on our slider here. So if I set this guy to 0.1, you can see that we get a nice contrast between our tiles and our caulking, as well as our little ornament here. And if I take a look, that might even be a little bit too deep. So I'm just going to come back to where we dialed down the opacity initially. And I'm just going to again decrease the opacity till we get something like around there. So now that we've got our base tile pattern down, I want to go ahead and start creating some edge damage that we're going to get along kind of just the edges and a side or along the caulking. And we're going to be able to use this later as a mask to tear away at the tiles and have an underlying coating of cement that's going to be able to visible through the cracks. So what I want to do is come down here where we've got some nice free real estate, and I'm going to add a levels node. I'm going to take our histogram scan here from our tile pattern, and I'm going to bring this guy right down into our levels. On top of our levels here, I'm going to immediately add an edge detect, and I'm going to just use this to kind of gauge where I need to increase or decrease values. And so right now it looks pretty good because I want to use this as kind of a mask in terms of what I'm actually chipping away at. And you'll see once I continue what I kind of mean by that. So what I like to do when focusing on my edge detail or my edge wear is I like to use slope blur grayscale. They're really the best at getting some organic looking edge destruction. And I like to kind of do it in two stages. The first one is kind of the larger destruction or the longer kind of indents. And then the second one is kind of my more finite or more minute kind of detail, which is a little bit smaller. So the first thing I'll do is add a slope blur grayscale. And I'm going to come down here and add a fractal sum base. And so when I take this guy right here and plug him in, we're going to get a big hot mess. And that's because we want to come down to our samples and bump that up just a little bit. And I want to bring my intensity down very, very low for right now. And you can see we're going to get some nice destruction already. But that's a little bit too minute or a little bit too microscopic for what destruction that I want to do first, because like I said, I like to do my larger destruction. So I'm going to come back to our sum base here. And immediately I'm going to take our max level down. And you can see that as I take it down every step, the destruction gets much more larger and not as noisy. So I'm going to bring that down to about 7. And I'm going to bring the min level up just a little bit. And so that's given us some nice larger kind of edge ripples and edge detail. I want to come back into my slope here. And I want to come down to mode. And so we get 3 different modes when we click on the little menu here. And they all do kind of slightly different things. Min is going to only take the part of the blur that cuts into the geometry. Max is going to do the parts that cut out of the geometry, and blur is going to try and blur both different blending modes. So for the mode, I generally choose min just because I like it as edge damage, so it's actually chipping away from our material. And now we can play around with different intensities to find something that suits kind of the look we're going for. And I think around 0.5, nothing too crazy for right now. That should be fine. And boy, was I wrong. So with our larger scale destruction done, I want to go ahead and start creating our smaller edge wear. So I'm going to add another slope blur. I'm going to take our fractal sum base here and Control D that, and I'm going to plug him into the bottom of our next slope blur. And so the same idea, we want to bring the samples up, bring the intensity down. And now I want to scroll in nice and close, and I want to click on our fractal sum base because I want to go back to our min and max levels here. And I want to bring our max level up just slightly. And we can play around with our min level to get more finite detail or a little bit larger and less noisy detail. And I think I'm going to bring that down to around 2. So now I want to come back to our slope blur. I want to make sure that I hit min, again, to keep chipping away at our material. And then you can play around with the intensity to get different effects. And so I want to do something like, let's do 0.25. We'll have what we did for our larger destruction. And so now we've got both our tile pattern and our edge damage filter or mask created. And now I want to go ahead and start combining the two so that they can work cohesively. But in order to do that, I need to create one more mask so that we're going to be able to keep the caulking and the nice ornament that we've created over top of our edgeware. So I want to go find some more free space, and I'm going to start by adding a histogram shift. I'm going to come down to our position, and it's going to shift all of our values uniformly. And what the histogram shift is going to do is when I slide the slider, it's going to shift all of our color values uniformly until it gets to either end of the spectrum. And from here, we're going to be able to find a nice kind of state that we're going to be used to create a mask for the caulking and the ornament. And so what I want to do with the shift here is I want to create an edge detect. And I want to come down and I want to make sure that we invert. And now I want to come down to our edge width. And I want to bring the edge roundness down as well. Just enough so that, again, we want to make sure that we don't get any peeking through of darker values, but we want to get it as little as possible. And now this mask is going to be able to help us when we're combining both our tiles and our edgeware, because it's going to allow us to keep the caulking and the ornament up over top when we combine and blend it together with our edgeware underneath. So now that we've got all the essentials for creating our blend, let's just go ahead and I'll show you how we're going to be able to actually merge both of our edge and our tile information. So I'm going to go ahead and create a blend. And I'm going to make sure to add our edgeware into the bottom, because it's going to technically be underneath of our metal parts here. And I want to make sure to add this guy in over top. I now want to make sure that we take our edge detect from our cross section here. I'm going to plug this guy into our opacity. And now when I double click on this guy, you can see why we went and created that mask, because we wanted to make sure that the edge detail or the edge damaging does not affect any of our metal parts here. And so we've effectively masked it off so we can make our destruction here pretty much as gruesome as we want, and it's not going to affect our metallic wear here. So now that I've got this guy here, I'm going to plug him right into our height and our normal map. And immediately you're going to see the drastic effect it's going to take, where we get a lot of our edges here not actually touching with the metal. So what I want to do to come in and kind of fix that is I'm going to come to our slope blur grayscale here and our second one in our chain. And I want to make sure that I come back to our mode and I want to set that to max. So we're going to get a little bit more kind of coming towards the outside of our tiles here and not so much cutting in and away. We can also single click on our fractal sum here, and we can play around with both the roughness and the global opacity. And you can see as we increase the roughness, so does the edge wear. And so now that we've kind of created, or we're on our way with our tile and the edge wear, I want to start by creating some of the underlying cement that we're going to get underneath each one of these tiles if we were to, remove them from our material. So I'm going to come down here to some more space. And I want to start by creating a Gaussian noise. And I'm going to start by drastically reducing the scale to something like 5. And I want to run this guy through levels because I just want to kind of lighten our values here. Maybe bring down our white output a little bit and bring up our black as well, just so we get a little bit of a less contrasted texture. So now what I want to do is blend this together, and I'm going to blend it with a directional noise 4. And so what I'm doing right now is just trying to create and build up an interesting looking texture, because we're going to use this as kind of a base coating for our concrete. And we're going to modify it and augment it in a way so that when we use this geometry, we have a lot of interesting nuances within the actual texture itself. And like pretty much anything I ever say, it will make a lot more sense as we continue down the chain. And so I'm going to click on our blending mode here, and I'm just going to scroll through until I find something that's kind of interesting. And I'm going to go with overlay. It's going to give us a nice little contrast. From there, I want to take this guy and I want to add a swirl grayscale. And this is going to do exactly like the name says, and it's just going to add a swirl modifier onto our texture. And we can come down here and we can play around with its rotation as well as its width and height. So I want to ×2, and I want to come down to the amount, and we can change how much it's actually swirling our texture in either direction. And so I'm going to add around probably 4. Because I don't want it to be too swirly, but I want to definitely have an effect on our geometry. From there, I'm going to add another blend, and I'm going to create another blended material just up top here. And what I want to do is add a crystal 2, and I want to run this guy through a swirl grayscale as well. Again, making sure that it's ×2. And I'm going to leave this on 8 for now. And so I'm going to plug this guy in. And again, I want to play around with different blending modes. And I'm going to stick with add sub. It's going to give us a lot of contrasting, but also somewhat smoother geometry for us to work with. From there, I'm going to add another blend, and I'm going to do pretty much the exact same thing. Except this time what I'm going to do is add a clouds 3 node, because I want to get a little bit more noisy detail, and we're going to swirl that, and we're just going to add it to the chain here. And so with that blending mode, I'm just going to leave it on max lighten. And now I want to start adding some edge wear to our actual swirls here. What I'm going to do is add a slope blur grayscale. And like usual, I'm going to add a fractal sum base because it's concrete and we want to give it a nice rough looking detail. Making sure to change our samples up, bringing our intensity way down. We can also play around with the max levels. And then we can also come back in and play with the mode. And I'm going to leave it on blur for now. The next thing I want to do is I want to have it kind of bumped up a little bit on our texture here, where in the center of it, where the major swirl is, I want to have that kind of be where the top of our geometry is going to be, or our highest point. And from there, it's going to fall off as we reach outwards. And so what I want to do is add another blend. And I'm going to create a shape node. And with the shape node, I'm going to go and find the paraboloid pattern. And I'm going to plug that guy in to our bottom here. And I'm going to take this guy and make sure to put it over top. And so right now it's not going to do anything, and that's because we need to come down to our blending mode and we need to change it to screen. And so now that's going to give us a nice lighter value in the middle, and towards the out of our texture it's going to fall off. However, I like to have a little bit more control over this, so I'm going to add a levels node onto our shape here, making sure to double click on our blend. And I just want to play around with some of our values. And even though I want it to be a little bit taller in the middle, I don't want to lose any of the data that we're getting from our other previous chain. So I want to bring down the white output just a little bit so that we're still getting some nice jagged detail. I also want to bring the black output out just a little bit so that it's affecting our entire texture here. We can also play around with where the fall off really hits hard, and you can see just slightly me playing around with it. And so something like that should be good. Now I want to warp this around a little bit to make it look not as uniform and swirly. And so what I'm going to do is add a directional warp, and I'm going to add another clouds 3. I'm going to plug this guy in. I want to come down and I want to see about an intensity of 50. And 50 looks like it's a little too much, so I might bring that down to something like 35. And from here we can just play around with the direction to get more interesting looking results. So I'm going to leave that at about 90. And so we've almost completed our undercoating for the cement. However, we need to now tile it to match up with the tiles of each of our marble slabs here. And so I'm going to add a tile generator onto this guy. Again, making sure that he's in the top input. And I want to come down to where we have our pattern, making sure to hit pattern input. And now we need to make sure that we input enough on the X and the Y amount to line up exactly with our other tiles. So by taking a look at our other tiles, you can see that we have 4 across and 4 down. So what I want to do with our cement here is I want to come into our X and Y amount, and I just want to do 4 by 4. You can see that if I click on this guy here, we've got 4 across, 4 across, 4 down, and 4 down. So we've got them lining up perfectly. But now I want to come in and kind of randomize the rotation, because if we were to remove 2 of these tiles side by side, we would get the same looking geometry, and that doesn't look good. So we want to randomize it just a little bit. So if we come back into our tile generator, we can scroll down and get random rotation. We can get the flip to make sure to enable that. And that's really about all we can do, because we don't want to actually affect the scale or any of the free rotation, because as you can see, we start to lose information or start to clip over top of other tiles. So the last thing that I want to do to kind of randomize things a little bit more is I'm going to add another directional warp. And with this guy, I'm just going to go back to our clouds 3 here, and I'm going to plug this guy in as well. And again, we can play around with the rotation, and it's going to give us some just random looking swirls, so that if we are to remove a tile that's right beside another tile, they're going to have different underlying geometry, so it's not going to look so cookie cutter. And so now before we go ahead and start blending the two together, I want to go ahead and create a random tile remover. So all I have to do is slide a slider up and down, and it's going to randomly remove tiles to expose the underlying cement. And so in order to start that, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create another tile generator. And with this guy, I'm going to go in and just add 4 by 4, because that is the current amount of tiles that we have for our material. I also want to come back in and switch our pattern to square. And you can see now if I scale down, we have 4 by 4 squares, and this matches up perfectly with our material. And so now how I'm going to go about using this as a random mask is when I come all the way down to our color tab here, you're going to see this slider called random mask. And as we click and slide it up, you can see that it's just going to randomly mask off and remove some of our squares. And so we're going to use this guy as kind of a opacity filter or a mask when we blend the two together. And I like to click on invert mask so that when we have our mask up at 1, we can just kind of peel away. And to me, that makes more intuitive sense as we're removing value and removing tiles. I'm going to keep that at 1 and leave that on true. And so now I'm going to create a blend node. And so I'm going to plug something into the foreground, background, and opacity of this blend. And so I'm going to start by taking our guy here and plugging him into our opacity. I'm also going to take our geometry here and I'm going to plug this in to the top node. And so what I'm going to plug into the middle or background is just a uniform color. I'm going to make sure to set it to grayscale. And I'm going to plug that in. And so now what that's going to do is if I double click on there and single click on my tile generator, I'm going to come down to our mask. And as I start to peel away our mask, it's going to peel away our geometry here. So that anywhere showing black is going to show up with our tile that we've set to that specific area or our cement. And so that's all fine and dandy, but if you come in, you can see that it's actually removing our metalwork as well. And I don't want to do that. So we have to come back, add another blend onto our chain here. We can go ahead and add this guy here in over top. And then we want to go back up to where we have our intersection mask. And we want to use that as the opacity for our blend here. And so now if I double click on that guy, you can see that it doesn't matter how many tiles we remove, our metal is still going to remain. And so now that's perfect. So now I'm going to plug this guy into our normal and our height. And I want to see what it looks like on our material here. So coming back into our tile generator. As we remove some, you can see that we no longer have tiles. And the next thing we're going to do is have it so that when we blend our materials together, whenever we have black on our texture, we're going to have our cement. So now in order to blend the heights between both of our geometry is pretty simple. I just want to come in here and add a height blend node. And it's going to be very informative with the inputs. And you can see that we have the height top, height bottom, and our mask. So with our height top, we want to think about our geometry in terms of what is going to be on top and what is going to be on the bottom. And it's pretty simple with our tiles, where we have the top being our tiles and the bottom being our cement. So I'm going to find where our tiles are here. And I'm going to take this guy here and plug him into our tile top, or our height top. From there, I'm going to come down to our concrete, and I'm going to bring this guy and put him into the height bottom. And as we look now, you can see that we're actually getting the height in the crevices where we've taken our edge wear. And in the darker values, it's going to appear. I now want to take the new mask that we've created, and I'm going to plug this guy into our mask output or input here. And you can see now we get the blending between both heights, where we have black values in our mask. Our underlying cement texture is going to show up. And if I come back to our tile generator and I play around with the mask, you can see that it's going to update accordingly. And so now I want to plug this guy into both of our height and our normal. And you can see the effect that it's going to take. And now that we're done with our geometry, I want to go ahead and start plugging our nodes into our outputs here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the base material. I'm going to plug our normal into our normal output. I want to take our histogram range here, plug it into our height, plug it into our ambient occlusion. I'm going to add an ambient occlusion node on top. And I want to make sure that in the parameters I come down and I want to set it to GPU optimization. And I want to decrease the height depth a little bit because you can see it's pretty dark right now. We want to have just a little bit of shadow information. As well, I want to go ahead and give it a uniform color for now so we can still kind of see what's going on our geometry here. I'm going to give it just kind of like a nice mid-gray. I also want to come down to our roughness and do the same thing so that we don't have too glossy or too matte of a material. So I'm going to come in and switch to grayscale. And I'm just going to bring that up about halfway or so. And for now, I'm just going to leave metallic, but we are going to come back because we want to make sure that we set our trim to a metal. So the first thing I want to do when creating a base color for marble is I want to get a cells 2. And with that, I want to come in. I want to make sure to set the scale way down to something like 4 or 5. We'll go 5. And I also want to make sure that I set the edge width really low. Something like 0.15. And now that I've got this set up, I want to go ahead and start distorting this. So I'm going to add a directional warp. And I'm going to add a clouds 2 node. And I'm going to use this guy as the intensity input here. And you can see this is going to give us some nice wavy lines if we kind of compare between the two. And you can randomize it even more by changing the warp angle as well as the intensity. If we set this up to something a little bit higher, we get more jaggedy lines. So I'm going to set mine to 25 intensity and 90-degree rotation for now. And I'm going to go ahead and warp this again to kind of give us a little bit more variation in the larger cells of our material, not just the edges. So I'm going to add a Gaussian noise. I'm going to plug this guy into our gradient input. And you can see that our noise is a little bit too small. So I want to go into the noise and I want to change the scale down because I want to affect it on a little bit more of a larger scale. So I'm going to go for around 10. And we can play around with the intensity as well to see if we get more interesting effects. I'm going to do 2.5. I like that. And now that we've got our large scale noise, I want to go ahead and create a transform 2D. And what I'm going to do with this is essentially do the same process. I just want to have a smaller version of this so that we can kind of blend together the two and create a nice looking marble. So I'm going to bring this guy into our transform here, and I'm going to come over to the parameters and I'm going to divide by 2. And what this is going to do is just basically shrink our texture by just kind of halving it. And so I'm going to add a directional warp. So I'm going to Control D on that guy there so that we get the same inputs. And I'm just going to drag the transform over top. So now we're transforming our smaller tiles. And so now that I've got these guys, I want to go ahead and blend them together. So I'm going to take this guy here, blend him in over top. And now with this, I want to make sure that we remove any of the white and we can still see the black over top of our bottom texture. So in order to do that, I just have to come down to our blending mode and I have to hit multiply. And so now that's starting to look pretty good, but I don't like how contrasted the entire thing is. And so I want to come into our opacity of our blend and I just want to bring it down just a little bit because I want our smaller cells here to be a little bit less opaque. I'm also going to add a levels node over top, and I'm just going to bring up our black output just a little bit because I want to create an overall kind of fade so that it's not as black and white. So now that we've got our marble texture here, I want to go ahead and start blending it together and making it wrap around tiles so that it doesn't look like we've just splayed this texture over top of everything, but each individual tile is its own separate entity. So I'm going to go ahead and drag these guys back. And the first thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to create a mask for us to use when we directionally warp this texture over top of our tiles. And so I'm going to come back over to our edge damage filter here, where we've got this mask between our metal and our tile here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a directional warp. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to plug it right into our intensity input here. And so when I bring this guy back up, you can see kind of slightly that it's using our mask to displace the texture over top. And if we go ahead and switch this up to something a little bit more intense, you can see that it's using it as a mask to basically place it over top of our tiles. However, because we have just a white and black mask, it's going to treat all of the colors that are the same as one mask. And we want to basically separate these into different grayscale values so that it treats every tile differently. So what I'm going to do for that is over top of our connection here, I'm going to add a flood fill node. And it's going to give us this nice looking rainbowy color. And it's going to allow us to use flood fill to random color. And so now you can see that we've got a varying degree of grayscale values, and it's going to allow us to randomly move around our marble texture here. And so now if I start to rotate it, you can see that it's rotating at different intensities. And if I bump this up to something like 150, you can see that they all start to randomize so that it doesn't look like our texture is just tiled over top of our material. And now the last thing I want to do for our base color here is I want to just kind of create a little bit of some noise kind of behind or underneath our cells here. And so in order to do that, I'm going to create a crystal 1 node here. And I'm going to just add this to a directional warp. And so what we're going to plug into our directional warp is I'm just going to go back here to our clouds, and I'm going to take this guy and plug it in. I also want to come back down here to our intensity and switch it up to something like 50. And again, just kind of play around with the intensity. I think I'm actually going to bump this up to 100. And yeah, I want to get something a little bit noisier. And so now that I've got this, I just want to blend this right before we actually directionally warp our material. So I'm going to take these guys here, plug it in over top. And now what I want to do is I want to come down to our blending mode and just hit subtract. I also want to come up to our opacity and change this to something around 0.7 so that it's a little less subtle, or a little more subtle, I should say. And so now when we look at our directional warp, we have a little bit of noise with our cells. And so now we can go ahead and plug this guy in, and we can start to see what it's going to look like on our material here. So now that we've created our base texture or base color for our marble, I want to go ahead and start creating a mask so that we can create a checkered board looking tile. So all we have to do for that is I want to take this directional warp here and I want to run it through an invert grayscale. And so I'm going to take this guy and plug it in, and you can see that we're going to get basically just the invert of what we have here. And so over top of our directional warp, I'm just going to add a blend. And so I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And now we need to create the mask that's going to allow us to show up only black and white on every other tile. And so all we have to do for that is create a tile generator. I'm going to plug him in. I'm going to come down to our X and our Y, and I'm going to just have 4 for each, because remember, we have 4 by 4 tiles. I'm now going to come down to our pattern, and I'm just going to hit square. And it may look like it's just one solid square, but if we come back down to our scale here, you can see that we actually have 4 by 4 squares. So we want to make sure that the scale is set to 1, and we want to come down to where it says color. And we want to go find our checker mask, and we want to set this to true. And as soon as we do, we're going to get this checker pattern, which is going to be used as a mask for our material here. So now we've got our black and whites showing up on every other tile. The next thing I want to do is I want to add the color for our trim here. And so in order to do that, we need to first create a blend. And because we're using a real world metal, we want to make sure that we're using real world values for the color. And so we actually have a node called the PBR metal reflectance values. And so what we get with this guy here is if we go into its parameters, we get a whole bunch of physically correct metal or color values for specific metals in our real world. And so I'm going to plug this guy in, and you can see that we're getting a red connection. And that's because we've tried to blend together a color node with a grayscale node. And so in order to fix that, all we need to do is make sure that we run this blend through a gradient map, and it's going to convert our grayscale into a color map. So now that we've got our color showing up, we want to make sure that we mask it off only to the areas that we've designated as our trim. And so we've actually created a mask for that. If we come back here to our cross section, you can see that we have our white areas as the trim. So I want to take this guy here, and I'm just going to plug it in to the opacity of our blend here. And now you can see that we're going to get our gold showing up right where our trim should be. And now we can change this to any metal color that we want. And so now the last thing that I want to do for the albedo is I want to create the base color for our concrete. And so I'm going to add another blend. And I'm going to bring in a uniform color node. And I'm going to plug this guy in. And so now we need to mask off our areas where we have our concrete, as well as the areas where we have concrete showing through on our tiles. And so we've actually created this mask already. So all we need to do is come back down to our tile remover mask, and you can see that we've created an inverted mask for our concrete here. So all we have to do is bring this guy into the opacity of our blend, and then we want to make sure that we add an invert grayscale onto that. And now we're going to get all of our tiles showing up right in the correct spot, and we're going to get our color values showing up for our concrete in the tiles where there is no actual marble and underneath the marble as well. And we can now play around with this color here to get any effect that we want. And so I'm going to bring this back to a little bit of a darker gray. Now that we've completed our base color, I want to go in and start messing around with the roughness of our material. So I'm going to come in here, and the first thing I want to do is I want to get all of the kind of edge detail that we're going to get, and we can draw that from our normal map because it gives us a lot of our point information of our material. I'm going to bring this guy back, and I'm going to use a curvature smooth node. I want to make sure that we keep our normal map plugged in there. And I'm going to use this guy to drive right into our roughness. And you can see that we're going to get some nice edge wear and nice edge detail, which is going to affect how our material interacts with light. Now the thing is with roughness is white indicates a rougher surface, a rougher area, and black indicates a much smoother surface. So all we have to do is we just create a levels node over top, and I'm going to come down and I'm going to invert the values so that we get our smoother areas kind of along the edges, and our rougher areas are going to be more towards the inner recesses of our material. So now we've got kind of a base for our roughness map, but I want to add a little bit more grunge kind of on top of our tiles here so that it's not just uniform. And so what I want to do with that is I'm going to create a clouds 3 node, and it's going to give us a lot of just random noise. And I'm going to add a directional warp. And what I want to do with this is kind of like what we did with our albedo here, and then I want to warp it around the tile geometry here using this mask that we've created with our flood fill. And so what I'm going to do is bring this guy into the intensity input here, and I want to start by bumping this guy up so that we get some kind of random detail over top of all of our tiles. And I'm actually going to bump this up to about, let's say 200. So we get just a fully randomized texture. I want to blend this now with our levels here. And so I'm going to add a blend and just bring this in over top. But the problem is I want this to only affect where our tiles are and not where we have concrete, because the concrete has its own roughness that I don't really want to touch. And so in order to do that, we have to come back down to our tile remover mask here. And I want to select this guy here because again, we're using this as a mask and masking off any of the concrete areas. I'm going to bring this guy into the blend as our opacity filter here. And now you can see we're only going to get the random noise showing up on top of our tiles. And so I'm going to go around and play with our blending mode a little bit. And I'm going to settle on subtract. I also want to bring our opacity down a little bit. There's something about, we'll say 0.7. And that's just going to help us sell the effect a little bit that this is a utilized surface, like a floor. So now that we've completed our roughness, I want to go ahead and start making our trim look metallic. And because we've already created a mask for it, it's actually as simple as plugging in one of our nodes. And so I'm going to come back to where we have our cross section here. And like I said, we've already created a simple black and white mask. And that's all we need to feed into our metallic in order for it to display our trim as a metal. And so I'm going to take this guy here and I'm going to plug him into our metallic. And immediately as I do that, you can see that our trim starts to look like a metal. And lastly, what I want to finish off with is I just want to add a blur onto our histogram range because it's a little bit too noisy for a height map. And with a height map, usually what you want is a little bit of a gradiated color range and not something that is too contrasting or too sharp. So with that, I'm just going to add a blur high quality grayscale. And I'm going to feed in our height blend here. And you can see immediately it's going to take our sharp and contrasted texture and heavily blur it. And I don't want it that much. So I'm going to bring our quality up to 1. And I'm going to bring our intensity way down to around something like 2. And when I plug this in, you can see the effect that it's going to have on our material. And it looks like 2 is a little bit too much. So again, I'm going to go back to our blur and I'm going to start to peel it away just until it starts to look a little bit nicer on the eye. And I'm thinking around 0.5 is a little bit nicer.